Hey folks, I'm William, this is RuneForged, welcome to the channel. Today I'm going to be talking about an upcoming tabletop RPG that seems to be flying under a lot of people's radar, but has players and DMs alike saying things like this. Definitely fixes combat and rests in a really interesting way. I love it, my players love it too. I've fallen in love with this system. This system is just so good. Simply goated. This saved 5e for me. And so on and so forth. I think you get the point. So, needless to say, I was very excited when I came across a preview of the upcoming Nimble 5e TTRPG system by Evan Diaz, which promised quicker and more exciting combats while still facilitating tactical and creative styles of play. Now, before I go any further, I just want to mention that I am not affiliated with Nimble in any way, and this is very much just a first impressions based on the free preview rules and a handful of the videos I've seen about the game. My goal for this video is not to convince you that Nimble is any better or worse than whatever game you're currently playing. It's just to spread awareness for a game that I'm personally very excited about and that I don't think is getting enough attention. So with that out of the way, let's talk about Nimble 5e. All right, so what I've got pulled up in front of me right now is the Nimble 5e free preview, and I figured we just kind of go through some of this together. I'm not going to read the whole thing word for word. I'll put a link to this down in the description in case you want to look at it for yourselves. But there are some things about this that I thought were noteworthy. I am going to start by reading the introduction here because I think the game designer is probably much better at describing what their game's about than I am. So let's go ahead and do that now. Your game nights are too precious to waste with slow or fiddly RPG rules. Slay the slog and empower your players and GM with more interesting choices, less waiting, and have more fun playing epic stories. Nimble is a fast, tactical, 5e compatible TTRPG that eliminates the slog using some of the best elements from the greatest RPGs around. At a time where more and more RPGs are taking a more rules heavy, granular approach, Nimble is going the opposite direction. Less waiting, more freedom, easier to run for the GM, and easier to pick up for new players so we can grow this wonderful hobby of ours. I think that's a pretty phenomenal intro. There's a lot of things here that I really appreciate. I am looking for a faster game that still focuses on being tactical. It would be nice if it's 5e compatible so that I can use all of the monsters and adventures that I've accumulated over the years. And I think that in particular, any game that sets out with the goal of eliminating some of the slog of 5e is going to be an improvement in my book. I'm also really interested to see more about how the game designer is going to incorporate this part about freedom for creativity and teamwork. I do know that there are some actions and reactions in the game that are a little bit more open-ended that give players a little bit of opportunity to flex those creative muscles, but I wonder if there's more stuff in there as well that I haven't found yet. Here in the bottom right here, there's a list of some of the key features of Nimble as outlined by the designer. Know instantly if you hit and how much damage you do. Exploding critical hits to retain the chaotic excitement of battle. Players being rewarded for smart positioning and clever teamwork, which sounds really awesome. New reactions, defend and interpose. We'll talk about those in just a minute. Interpose in particular I think is really cool. More player agency through flexible action economy, strategic weapon systems, and more. Interested to see more about that. Deep yet focused. I am actually really excited about the streamlined character sheet. I think that it's a pretty common joke that the 5e and Pathfinder character sheets look a little bit more like tax forms than they do some sort of game aid. So I'm always in favor of a more minimalistic approach when it comes to character sheets. I'm very interested in this overhaul magic and spell system. I've never been a huge fan of the concepts of spell slots. I think they're fine, probably in video game adaptations, like Baldur's Gate 3, for example, was fine. But when you're trying to track this at the table, it just adds another level of unnecessary bookkeeping, in my opinion. As mentioned earlier, the game does appear to be 5e compatible, at least in some sense. I've heard that you're able to use your existing monster stat blocks and adventures with a little bit of tweaking and use them directly in the Nimble 5e system, which is very exciting. There's also, I think, 11 different classes and 22 subclasses by default, although I think I also saw on the Backerkit page that there were some stretch goals for some additional classes. I don't think we're going to go over classes too much in this video, but I may make follow-up videos if people seem interested. This also talks about a new legendary monster system to make monsters easier to run for the DM. This is also a problem in 5th edition with some of these larger or legendary creatures that not only have multiple regular actions each, but can also have legendary actions, layer actions, etc. And it can be a lot to manage the table, especially if you're trying to run multiple of these legendary creatures at one time. Um, and I find that it's actually pretty difficult to run some of these creatures, especially optimally, if you are just like kind of flipping open to the page of the book and are trying to run this kind of on the fly. So I'll be curious to see what sort of improvements and streamlining we see to monster stat blocks here. And last of all, easy to learn and teach new players. This is a big deal for me. I know that when I'm trying to learn a new game, when I sit down and I see a 300 or 400 page rule book, and that's just part of the barrier of entry to start a new game, I mean, it's pretty discouraging. And you really have to sit down and think about whether this is a game that's really going to be worth your time. You know, there's always a possibility that you get through this entire rule set and you decide this is not the thing for you, and that's a pretty significant amount of resource and time expended for something you're not going to end up using. I also think it's really important to be able to have a system that can easily onboard new players who might be interested in the hobby. 5e is definitely less complex and less crunchy than some systems out there, but I don't think it's controversial to say that 5e is not necessarily the easiest system to pick up. There are a lot of rules and nuances, and again, the character sheet is pretty large and fairly complex, especially for someone who isn't used to playing tabletop RPGs. It's nice to have a game that is a little bit more rules light, a little bit more nimble, if you will, in order to get players introduced to the hobby. And then you can always try to get them to play more complex games down the line if they decide that they enjoy the hobby. It is worth noting that what we're looking at right now is just the free preview. It's only a small selection of what will be available in the overall game. You know, we'll probably only go through the first 3 or 4 pages, get a feel for some of the basics and a broad overview of the system. And then if there's interest, maybe we can do a deeper dive into some of the classes and additional mechanics. Let me know down in the comments if that's something that you folks would be interested in, and we'll see if we can make that happen. All right, moving right along to page 2, we're going to talk a little bit about combat in Nimble 5e, starting with the action system. Folks that are familiar with Pathfinder 2e will probably be right at home here. Basically, how this system works is that each hero gets 3 actions per turn, which they can use to move, attack, cast spells, etc. Generally, any one thing that you do in combat will cost you 1 action, although there are more powerful spells and abilities which may cost you more than 1 action. It is interesting to note that your actions actually recharge at the end of your turn rather than at the beginning. This is important because the actions that you get on your turn, you can also spend doing reactions when it isn't your turn. I really like this because it creates some interesting tactical decisions where you have to make a decision about whether or not you want to use one of your reactions now, but at the expense of making yourself a little bit weaker or having fewer actions during your next turn. I think that's really cool and interesting. I think that this 3-action system is a really interesting contrast to what's currently being done in 5th edition, where you have your standard action, your bonus action, and then reactions split up into different actions. I like this more uniform system a lot more. I think it's more intuitive, and I think it's a lot easier for new players to grasp. Next, let's talk about the attack action, which works a lot differently than it does in 5e. Instead of rolling a d20 and comparing that against the target's armor class, you're actually just going to be rolling the damage die associated with whatever weapon, skill, or ability that you happen to be using. And when you roll that dice, if you roll a natural 1, that means the attack is a miss and does no damage. On the flip side, if you score the maximum value on that die, so for example a 6 on a 1d6, then you actually score what's known as an exploding critical hit. And when you score an exploding critical hit, not only are you going to ignore the creature's armor, if it has any, you're also going to be able to roll that damage dice again and add the second result to the first result. And this can actually keep compounding as long as you keep rolling the maximum amount on the dice. I've seen this system in other games, and I can tell you that it is very exciting. And it creates some really awesome moments where you can really stage a huge comeback or an awesome moment. And I think that just really feels good in general. So I'm excited to see this in this game. Another important mechanic to consider when you are using the attack action is a mechanic called rushed attacks. Heroes can use multiple attack actions on their turn, but each additional attack beyond the first suffers an additional stack of disadvantage, which overall is going to increase the chance that you miss with your attack and also reduce the average damage per attack going forward. So that's an important way to counterbalance multiple attacks in one turn. And it also creates interesting tactical decisions with players having to decide whether or not they want to use a debuffed attack action or whether they want to use one of the more obscure or non-combat focused actions that the game provides. There's also a little bit of information here about the cast spells action. I'm not going to go super in depth on this because I'm not very familiar with how magic works in this game, but I do know that they have ditched the traditional spell slot system in favor of a spell points / mana system, which I personally am very excited about. And I also know that you have the ability to upcast spells by spending more mana on them, which can create different effects based on which spell you're casting. One action that I'm particularly excited about is the assess action, which basically lets you take an action to kind of survey the battlefield or particular opponents and try to glean some sort of important information that your character might not otherwise have access to. You know, maybe this could be something as simple as figuring out like roughly how many hit points the creature has left, or something as interesting as trying to figure out what their next move is going to be in combat. I think this is a really cool system. My group uses this in other games, although obviously we usually have to homebrew it in some form or another. So it's nice to see this cool functionality baked directly into the system. I think this is going to create some really interesting tactical choices where, you know, maybe you've already attacked one or more times this round and your next attack is either unlikely to hit or unlikely to do a lot of damage, and it may be more tactically beneficial to get some information on your opponent rather than just rolling to attack again. So I think this is great. There is also a move action here, which I don't think warrants too much additional discussion, but it is important to understand that just like in 5th edition, this movement can be broken up. So you can move a little bit, do an attack, and move back all with the same move action, which I think is perfectly acceptable. As you expect, moving through difficult terrain halves your movement. No surprise there. I think that's a fine rule. Nimble also includes what they call heroic reactions, which function fairly similarly to what you would see in 5th edition with a couple important changes. One I think we already touched on is that in order to do a heroic reaction, it requires one of your basically action points from your regular round. So if you do decide to use a reaction when it is not your turn, on your next turn, you will have one fewer action to work with. So that creates some interesting tactical decisions that you need to make. Also, you can use more than one reaction on your turn. You just can't use the same reaction more than once a turn. So you can defend and interpose, for example, but you can't defend twice or interpose twice. I think that's a pretty interesting rule. It allows you to combine reactions in interesting ways, but also helps to avoid abusing certain reactions that might be stronger than others. I won't go through all of the reactions here. You're welcome to read them for yourself, but I think that the defend and interpose actions are particularly interesting. In this game, as I understand it, characters don't really have a passive defense the same way that you would have a passive armor class in 5th edition. You actually have to actively use a defend action in order to reduce incoming damage from attacks. Again, I think this could be pretty cool. I think this creates another interesting decision for the player about whether or not it is worth it to defend against an attack at the cost of, you know, having to give up an action on their next turn. So I'm interested to see how that plays out. But the really exciting new option here is called Interpose. And it says that if an ally within 10 feet would be struck with an attack, you can push them out of the way and become the new target of that attack. You enter their square and move them to an adjacent square of your choice. I think this is really awesome. Again, this is something that my group does on a regular basis. I think this is awesome, and I'm really happy to see it codified directly into the core rules, so that it'll hopefully see more use and more regulated use at the table. So I think that's awesome. There are also opportunity attacks and help reactions, which I think work in ways that are probably pretty intuitive to you if you're coming over from 5e. One thing to note is that all opportunity attacks in Nimble 5e are made with disadvantage, so they are a little bit less powerful than what you would see in 5th edition, and they're also just not an automatic choice. So again, there's another tactical decision to be made here, which I think will create deeper gameplay, which I'm very excited about. It's also worth noting that common monsters don't make opportunity attacks by default, so this is not something that hopefully will be bogging down your game too much and will hopefully encourage players to move around the battlefield a little bit more, creating a more dynamic combat. It is worth noting that Nimble handles initiative pretty differently from standard 5th edition, so I'm going to read through some of the most important bits here. A combat counter begins when the GM tells the party to roll initiative. Each player will roll 1d20 and add their initiative. If the result is a single digit, that character starts combat with 1 action. If the result is 2 digits, they start combat with 2 actions. And a result of 20 plus nets you all 3 actions. Regardless of what a hero rolls on initiative, at the end of their turn, they gain all 3 actions back. And before we get into any sort of analysis, let's also talk a little bit about turn order. When combat begins, heroes go first. Whichever player is ready first goes first, with play proceeding around the table clockwise. The GM can hold all of the monsters' turns to the end of the round, or interleave their turns between the heroes' turns as the story demands. I definitely understand what they were going for when they were writing these rules. For any folks who have ever played 5th edition in person, trying to handle initiative can be a little bit of a painful and time-consuming process. First the DM asks for everybody to roll their initiative, then the DM kind of has to go around the table and figure out what everyone's initiative is, and then they're either putting it down on some sort of tracker or they're tracking it using clothespins on their DM screen, or any number of a dozen different systems that people have devised in order to make this process a little bit less painful. I think this is a perfectly fine way to handle initiative, especially if you're playing in person around a table. What I do like about this system is that your initiative does still matter in a mechanical sense. So at the beginning, we talked about when you are rolling initiative, you're basically just seeing how many actions that you'll be getting during the first round of combat, either 1, 2, or all 3. I think this is a really interesting balance, because you've still got the speed and fluidity of just picking one of the players and going clockwise around the table, or counterclockwise if you're a rebel. So you have that aspect, which keeps it pretty simple, but you're still getting a benefit from having a good initiative score. I also think that the little bit of element of randomness at the beginning, where you're not really sure exactly how many actions you're going to be getting, is both thematic and adds a little bit of spice and variety to combat that I don't think that you would see otherwise. So I will say I'm a little bit hesitant about the initiative system overall. It's a little bit different from what I've seen and might be a little bit fiddly, but I'm excited to try it out at the table and see how it goes. All right, let's talk a little bit about hit points, exhaustion, and death. And for this section, I think I'm just going to read it verbatim, because I think the rules do a pretty good job of explaining what this is supposed to look like. Your hit points represent your ability to take damage and keep going. Taking damage lowers your HP. When you drop to 0 HP, you gain 1 level of exhaustion and the dying condition. While you are dying, actions are limited to 1 round, concentration is broken, and continuing to fight may further harm you. So, attacking or casting spells causes 1 level of exhaustion unless you make a DC 10 strength save. Taking damage while dying causes 2 levels of exhaustion, and a crit causes 3 instead. Exhaustion. Exhaustion represents serious injuries you've taken. It is a long-term gauge of how close you are to death. Looks like each level of exhaustion gives you -1 to d20 rolls when outside of combat per level of exhaustion. HP can usually be recovered quickly, but exhaustion may take many days of resting to fully recover. So it looks like you regain 1 level of exhaustion per successful long rest that you were able to take. Death. A hero dies when they receive their last level of exhaustion, which is 6 by default. There are some ways to revive a hero who has died, but they come at a cost. A soul can be coaxed back to the realm of the living only so many times before becoming untethered, or worse. ... So, what do I think about this? I think this is great. I think that one of the big issues that 5th edition suffers from in combat is this situation where I guess people refer to it as the yo-yo effect, where a character will go down to 0 hit points and then they'll pop right back up with a healing word. They'll go back down to 0 and they'll pop back up again. And it doesn't really seem to have any meaningful or lasting consequences, when in reality you would think that would be a pretty traumatic and overwhelming experience. So I think that the inclusion of exhaustion, which only goes away on long rests, goes a long way to add some additional stakes and long-term consequences to combat. So I'm here for that. I also like it that the dying condition doesn't prevent you from taking actions. I think it's really cool that you still have 1 per round, and that trying to exert yourself further might result in further levels of exhaustion. I think this is a really cool tactical decision that the player is going to need to make. Are they just going to try to move away and avoid damage at all costs, or are they going to try to go out in a fiery blaze of glory? I think that's really cool. Nobody I know likes to be knocked unconscious at the beginning of the battle and just stay that way for the entire fight. It's boring. I don't really think it's adding anything, and I think this implementation is much more exciting while still also adding an element of danger and excitement. So I'm all for this. I think this is great. So after reading through these first few pages of the free preview, I have to say that I'm pretty excited about Nimble 5e. Normally at this point when I'm reading through a new TTRPG product, I found multiple things that I either don't really like that much, or I feel like I would have to house rule or homebrew in some way. Or I just find the overall page count of the document or the layout to be a little bit overwhelming. So I'm pretty excited about Nimble 5e so far. I think there's a lot more to come on this, and I'm really eager to see what else this game has in store for us. If you would like to support the game, it is available on Backerkit. I'll make sure to put a link to that in the description. Also, be sure to tell me if there was anything about Nimble 5e that you found particularly exciting, or that you found particularly not exciting. I'd be really interested to hear y'all's thoughts on that as well. If you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing to the channel and watching this next video full of TTRPG goodness. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.